Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and welcome to our climb tutorial in the iniBuilds Airbus A330 in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. We have completed the after takeoff procedure and we are now in the climb out to our cruising level. So, as we're about to pass the transition altitude at 5,000 feet, we can set our altimeter to standard by pulling the knobs out and setting the standby to standard as well, and cross-checking with the other side. The call-out here is set standard, standard cross-checked, passing flight level 50, now. And at now, you verify all three altimeters. The A330 should normally be flown in managed modes as much as possible. So, we've got managed speed, we are using nav mode, and we are using managed climb. You can see that we are using the derated climb over here, which results in somewhat of a restricted rate of climb. If we need to increase our rate of climb though, we can always remove the derate by pressing the clear button and then removing the derate from here. As long as we are using the managed modes, the aircraft is going to abide all restrictions, such as the 220 knot restriction that we've just overflown, which is the reason why it now starts to accelerate towards 250 knots. In general, you will notice that the A330 does not climb as well as your favorite other Airbuses. That's because the engines should be flown with the derated climb, and that's because the aircraft in itself is a long-haul aircraft, so you do have plenty of time to reach your cruising altitudes. Typical times to reach cruising altitude are in the region of approximately half an hour to 35 minutes if you're flying in rather warm air. The rates of climb will normally be somewhere in the region of about 2,000 feet a minute, below level 100, and rapidly reducing above level 100, especially at high gross weights. We're about to approach 10,000 feet, and at 10,000 feet we have the 10,000 feet flow pattern that we can carry out. Now, let's go ahead and have a look at what the 10,000 feet flow pattern is. Passing 10,000 just now. So the landing lights are going to go off unless you're flying in an airspace where VFR traffic may be expected above level 100. That's the case, for example, in North America. Over there you would leave the landing lights on until flight level 180, where VFR traffic is no longer going to occur. The seatbelts can be turned off as soon as turbulence is no longer expected, and the pitch is expected to stay below 7 degrees. Remember, 7 degrees is the third line over here on your primary flight display, and normally that is going to be the case in the A330 when you are above level 100. However, we might expect a little bit of turbulence going through these clouds up here, so for this reason I am going to leave the seatbelts on for now. Next we move down to our EFIS control panel, and if the constraints are no longer needed, we can select airports over here in order to get the airports displayed on our nav display. Moving further down into the FMS, we can clear any of the entries we have previously done that are no longer needed. So that includes the fix page, so flight plan, fix info, we can clear anything that we have up here, we can clear anything in the radio nav page, and we can copy the secondary flight plan. Last but not least, we go into the progress page and check the optimum versus the cruising altitude. Now, since we have just passed the last expected turbulence, let's go ahead and turn the seatbelt sign off so that our cabin crew can start their service. The next thing we need to talk about is our cruising altitude. Now, as you can see down here, we've got a filed cruise level of 390, an optimum flight level 400, and a maximum level of flight level 415. In general, the Airbus A330 can go up to flight level 410, and even with a fully loaded A330-300 you can definitely expect to get up to these very high flight levels. The A330 has the wings designed for an A340-300, which can be some 40 tons heavier, so you do have a lot of performance available from your wings. In general, you want to fly as close to the optimum flight level as possible, and since the optimum is only going to increase during the flight, provided that weather doesn't play an influence here, such as stronger tailwinds down below. So, even though we have planned to cruise at flight level 390, it would only be logical to climb to flight level 410 instead. So let's go ahead and do that, and set flight level 410 on our FCU. And since that is above the planned cruising level, we've just got to press the FCU knob in, and now you can see it's updated the cruising altitude, and it's also saying new cruise alt flight level 410 down here. And on the PFD we can verify that alt cruise is blue and flight level 410 is blue. Now let's go ahead and talk about anti-icing. Even during the high summer times, chances are you will eventually enter some icing conditions when you are flying through clouds at the higher altitudes. But what exactly are icing conditions? Icing conditions exist when the TAT is plus 10 degrees Celsius or below, and the SAT is minus 40 degrees Celsius or above. In other words, TAT 10 degrees or less, SAT more than 40 degrees, and visible moisture, and that are the conditions for icing. Now, visible moisture can be anything from rain over clouds, over fog, you name it. If anti-ice is needed, the procedure is quite simple. You go to the overhead panel, turn on the engine anti-ice, and the anti-ice is going to start to work. The aircraft is equipped with an icing detector, the probes of which are located on the very forward fuselage, right over here. And if your anti-ice is turned on, but the aircraft does not detect any icing, after a certain while it's going to write ice not detected on your ECAM. In general, if anti-ice has been used and you've left the icing conditions, it is advisable to leave the engine anti-ice on until the ice not detected message shows up. Otherwise, when you turn the anti-ice off, you are rather likely to get an ECAM message saying ice detected, demanding the anti-ice to be turned on again. This is a little safety precaution there in order to reduce the effect of the icing conditions, and in order to be sure that your anti-ice stays on until the last pieces of ice have melted off your aircraft. Something you will notice is that the rate of climb of the aircraft is eventually going to become less than 1,000 feet a minute. Right now we're at a very low growth weight at just 172 tons, so the aircraft is climbing rather well. But if you reach a point in time where a better rate of climb is required, then you can remove your climb derate. It's totally up to the pilot to decide when exactly you want to do that, and in general it is most cost effective to keep the derate in for as long as possible. Remember, you are flying a long-haul aircraft here. How much does it really matter whether you take 30 minutes or 35 minutes to get to your cruising level if you're flying for 10 hours anyway? In any case, if it is decided to remove the climb thrust derate, you can do that through the clear button and then removing it up here, and you will see that the thrust mode changes to thrust climb, and in general you will gain round about 500 to 700 feet a minute depending on the climb derate that's been used. If you delete a derate 2, you will gain a little bit more than if you delete a derate 1. You might as well at any time reinsert the climb derate if needed, which is going to save a little bit more cost. So let's say we've had an ATC restriction to climb at 2000 feet a minute or greater, and ATC have lifted that restriction from us. Now we can go ahead and we can enter the climb derate once again, verify thrust declimb 2, and now we are saving a little bit of cost once again. Now, how is the cost saving achieved? That's quite easy. In general, have a look at the EGT. We are running an EGT of round about 800 degrees over here, and if I'm now going ahead and deleting that climb derate, Let's have a look at what happens to our EGT. So look at that, 790 degrees right now, engine thrust is increasing, and it looks like iniBuilds have not simulated this properly at this point. Normally you would see an EGT increase of around about 40 degrees to 50 degrees, and that can have a rather significant impact on your overall engine life, because the engine life is going to be significantly reduced if the engines are running at the higher temperatures for longer. The aircraft is automatically monitoring the EGT and dynamically sending that data to the company so that the company gets live data and can decide live on the timing needed for maintenance. Now let's take a small moment and have a look at a couple of the further procedures and recommendations. So the Flight Crew Operations Manual gives us a couple of tips for our flight. Let's go ahead and start with the basics. So the recommended modes for the climb are the managed modes. However, you can choose between either managed or selected. Managed means the FMGS is controlling your flight path. So it's following the route, it's following the speed, it's following the altitude constraints, and basically the computer is doing everything for you. Selected, on the other hand side, means the pilot is taking control of things. Let me show you an example. Right now we are flying completely managed, so you can see all the dashes up here on the FCU, and you can see the managed modes are active on the FMA, so you've got climb and nav. Now, if air traffic control wants us to fly a certain airspeed, let's say they want us to fly 280 knots, then Airbus recommends, since it is only an intermediate intervention, that we use a selected mode for it. So let's say speed 280 is advised by air traffic control, then we're going to pull the speed knob and dial in 280 knots. Now you can see the speed target has changed from magenta into blue, and the aircraft is now pitching in order to follow that new speed target. When ATC relieves us of the speed restriction, we can just push the knob back in, and now we go back to the managed speed, which represents the most economical airspeed for our aircraft to fly, based upon data such as your aircraft's gross weight or the cost index in use. In general, you can adjust the cost index as needed. So let's say, for example, we are running a little bit late, then I could increase my cost index, for instance, towards 80, and now the aircraft is going to accelerate a little bit, which means we are going to get to our destination earlier, but on the other hand side, we are going to lose a little bit of fuel, since the aircraft has higher drag at the faster airspeed. For the purpose of this demonstration, let's go back to our cost index 10 and resume our econ flight. Certain modes are coupled to one another. You can, for example, not use the managed climb mode while you're under heading mode, because the aircraft doesn't know any vertical profile if you're not following the route. Let's go ahead and demonstrate this. So I'm going to dial in a left-hand turn over here towards heading 180. Dial it in, pull the knob, and you can see now the aircraft reverts to heading, and the vertical mode reverts to open climb, which is accompanied by the triple chime that we have just heard, or by the triple click, we should call it correctly. The triple click indicates to us that a mode has reverted, and in this case it was the climb mode which has changed into open climb. Open climb ignores any restrictions that we may previously have had in our flight plan, such as altitude restrictions. If we want to return to our route, the easiest way to do that is by entering a direct, so we can go onto the direct page, select the waypoint in question. For example, we want to fly to Baynard right now, select that, and then we can choose direct to Baynard up here. And now the aircraft will start a right-hand turn towards Baynard and has resumed navigation in nav mode. You will notice, however, that it does not automatically return to climb mode, so in order to do that, we actually need to push the altitude knob in, so that we return to the climb mode. If you've got to use only a small altitude change, let's say ATC demands us to level off in flight level 300. So that's flight level 300 blue. Let's say we have to level off in flight level 300 right now because of traffic that might be above our current altitude. If ATC now changes our clearance and wants us to climb, for example, from a level flight in flight level 300 to flight level 310, so only a small change in altitude, then Airbus does recommend the use of vertical speed mode and to climb at less than 1000 feet a minute, as it makes the guidance smoother and needs less thrust variation. So let's have a look. We're in flight level 300 now, and ATC wants us to climb to flight level 310. We're going to change the FCU to flight level 310, but instead of pushing the knob in to go to climb, we are going to use vertical speed mode. So let's use 500 feet a minute over here, pull the knob out, and now we got vertical speed plus 500, and you can see this only demands a small change in the thrust, and for the passengers this climb is basically not going to be noticeable at all. So this really gives us a very, very smooth climb and a very, very smooth operation, making it as comfortable as possible for our passengers. In general, when ATC assigns a new altitude, it is recommended that you use the altitude selector, change it to steps of thousands, then dial in the new altitude, say flight level 410 again, but thereafter return the selector back to the 100 position. The background for that is that if you now accidentally touch the knob, you change your altitude to something strange, like flight level 411. That is not the flight level that ATC would usually clear you to. So that is very easy to notice. Alright, let's push the knob back in, thrust direct climb 2, climb flight level 410 blue. And we've just got to change that cruising level again, since I dialed it above the actual cruising level, so let's remove that. Here we go. Now, when we are climbing and the rate of climb eventually goes below 1000 feet a minute, that is when it is recommended to remove the climb derate. Personally, I'm happy to keep it in until about 700 feet a minute in order to really conserve engine life, but keep an eye on the rate of climb, as the A330 is really not the best climber, especially at higher gross weights. Now let's go ahead and have a look at a couple of the further features we have available in the climb. One of the positive points of the aircraft climbing, so I don't want to say bad, but climbing at such a low rate of climb, is your cabin vertical speed. You will notice that the cabin itself is climbing at only around 300 to 400 feet a minute, usually centering at about 350 feet a minute, making it very, very comfortable for the passengers and reducing the amount of pain that may be inflicted by the larger rates of climb that you see in a couple of different aircraft. From my personal experience, I can say that coming from the 737, which often gave you up to 1000 feet a minute cabin rate of climb, the A330 is really, really smooth. Now a little real-world fact over here. It is recommended to keep the headsets on until you're reaching your top of climb, and only then to switch to the loudspeakers. However, the aircraft itself is so quiet that unless you're flying close to the red band, you could theoretically take the headsets off from about 10,000 feet onwards. If the headsets are taken off, then be very sure that the volume is set to an appropriate level. So normally I would turn my volume at least somewhere over here to the 2 o'clock position, and then also turn the loudspeaker up a little bit until I hear some ATC transmissions, and then I can fine-tune it with the loudspeaker knob up here. While we're climbing, be sure to keep the weather radar at a decent angle. Unfortunately, we don't have an automatic weather radar on this one, so we actually need to position it manually. So something around 0 degrees is normally going to work rather fine, but if you really need to analyze where the weather is along your flight path, you can switch over to the bird over here, and now this tells you the angle at which you're climbing, so roughly 3 degrees for us at the moment. Note that this can become much lower. So if you now switch the weather radar to this angle, then you will see exactly which weather is along that flight path that you have just dialed in. Normally though, it is recommended to keep the crosshair flight director like we have it over here, and only to use the bird temporarily for measures like this one. Now, as we're climbing up to cruise level, you will notice that we do take around half an hour to 35 minutes, so it is a pretty long climb for us. During that time, a lot of things might happen, such as the need to use the anti-ice or different speed restrictions and so on. The most important thing over here is that Airbus basically wants the airplane to be all managed with all lights out. So whenever you had to do some change for whatever reason, be sure that you check for those changes every now and then, so that you don't accidentally keep the anti-ice on, which might reduce the amount of thrust you have available and therefore reduce your rate of climb even further. Especially when you're flying in the tropics, where it is hot outside, where you typically have heavy aircraft as you are flying long range, and where you might typically need anti-ice at the higher altitudes, it might be very easy to forget the anti-ice and eventually end up with it turned on. The same goes for other changes you might have to do temporarily. Think, for example, forgetting to turn the packs on after takeoff, even though you are going to get a warning for that. So overall, keep a good eye on your aircraft, keep a good eye on what's turned on and what's turned off. Throughout the climb, you will see the aircraft starting to transfer fuel when passing about flight level 255 in the climb. Now, the fuel transfer logic is fully automatic and depends on the weight of the aircraft and the amount of fuel that you have, as well as the center of gravity. The aircraft is following a specific center of gravity target and is automatically going to pump fuel from the two main tanks over to the trim tank, and while it's doing that, it's not only pumping fuel, but it is also going to balance out the fuel you have on board. So right now, on this flight, we have so little fuel on board that it's not going to transfer anything. However, on a longer flight, if we had the difference of 300 kilos over here that's been caused by the APU usage on the ground, then it would start to transfer fuel only from the right-hand tank until the levels are equal, and then transfer fuel from both sides. Something that is worth noting is that once the aircraft starts to transfer fuel, you will eventually end up with bits of fuel that are being left in the pipes. That fuel is going to miss from your fuel indication, which may lead to a fuel indication that is lower than what you would expect. I've seen differences of up to 1,000 kilos of fuel in practical operation already. Now, that is nothing to worry about. In the descent, when the aircraft is pumping the fuel back forward, that's all going to flow back into the main tanks, and that fuel amount is eventually going to come back. However, you will notice that the expected fuel on board at the destination is going to drop because the FMS is calculating with the fuel that it gets from the fuel quantity indication system. So let's go ahead and close that one again. So we are getting very close to our cruising altitude. You can see our rate of climb is significantly reduced right now, only 500 feet a minute, and this is the latest point in time to take that climb derate out, so that the aircraft is going to continue to climb at a decent rate. So the derate is out, we can see thrust climb over here, and that should give us the last couple hundred feet a minute until we eventually reach our cruising altitude of flight level 410. In general, it is recommended to keep sterile cockpit practices. That means reduce all unnecessary communications to the operational minimum in the first 10,000 feet above your field elevation, and then also in the last 1,000 feet up to your cruising level. So right now we've got 1,000 to go, and until we're level in flight level 410, we would stop talking about the nice stewardess that we might all be talking about, but just focus on the aircraft and its trajectory. In general, the climb is going to use about 5,000 to 6,000 kilograms of fuel, as we can see over here. So that is about the amount of fuel that an A320 would use for the entire route down to Palma. The A330 tends to use a little bit more. As we're climbing, we do keep an eye out on the SAT. Once it's below -40, we no longer need the anti-ice, which is something that we should definitely keep in mind. You will notice when you're getting into the higher levels that your cruising speed is eventually going to get somewhere in the region of around 10 knots or so of the green dot, up to when you're getting up to the maximum flight level. Remember, right now we've got a maximum level of flight level 415. As we're about to intercept our cleared altitude, we see Alt Cruise Star coming on. And the aircraft is going to level off, and eventually the star is going to vanish. Here we go, Alt Cruise, and that completes our climb. When the climb is complete, we select the TCAS into the below mode, since any problems that we may face are now going to be below us in case of an emergency descent. And this concludes our climb tutorial in the Airbus A330. I hope you learned something today, and I hope that you have enjoyed this one. Leave your feedback in the comments below, and as always, if you're up for more, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and last but not least, if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.